The May 15th Blue Ribbon Housing Committee. We have a couple members absent. I will just start the meeting by saying we have a hard stop today at 6:45. Planning Board is after us, and so that's kind of, one of our meetings a month falls on Planning Board. Everyone got the agenda. Do you have a hard copy? Perfect. So we will go through and start with attendance. I am here, Assistant Mayor Kelly. Jen?
Here.
Eric?
Here.
Tracy?
Here.
Megan?
Here.
Dagan?
Here.
Mary?
Here.
Byron?
Here.
Councillor Beth Moreau?
Here.
Perfect. And absent.
John is on.
Oh, and there we go.
John.
Councillor Tabor is here.
Here.
Perfect. Mr. O'Leary is under the weather, so he unfortunately cannot be joining us today. So with that, our goal today, we have Planning Board Chairman, why am I saying us so much? Planning Board Chairman Rick Chalman to go over some of the Planning Board zoning things that we have talked about. I know one of the things the group has mentioned is that we really want to try to make sure that everyone is on the same level of some knowledge. And then, as everyone's on the agenda, we're really going to start going over what our work plan will look like and how we will formulate that. And that will determine kind of the pace that we start really cracking things down. Good news before we start, the RFQ, request for qualifications from developers, has gone out for Sherburne. I think the deadline is June 7th. 7th. So that is listed on our website. And then it went to, I think, 20-ish for-profit, nonprofit developers that build and have knowledge of building below market rate housing.
But it's also posted on the city's website.
But it is on the website.
And it's going to disperse and broaden it.
Yes, so we are hoping to get a bunch of RFQs in and then take that process from there. So with that,
Will RFPs follow that process?
I'm not sure.
I think it says that in the.
It says that I think it's an option. The city has left it open that we could go to RFQ, or we could just RFP, or we could just choose a developer. But it is left open, worded in the RFQ.
I don't know if we want to have any discussion on that, or you just follow your agenda, but I do have some questions about that. Only that we discussed it at the last meeting with regards to process, or whether it's going to go RFQ, RFP. We're on a somewhat of a short fuse with this thing, as long as it meets some type of August deadline date for housing credit applications to the federal government. But how are we supposed to interpret what was going to take place at Sherburne if we don't see any type of plans, or if we don't see, if it's an RFQ and they just issue their qualifications, how is an RFP or how is anything going to develop so that we might be able to see what is going to go on at that property? So I think it's an important distinction of how the process goes. If it's an option of the city, then I read the RFQ and it didn't specify that a applicant would deliver any type of plans. We don't know if it's going to be 160 units, 80 units, 40 units, this type of thing. So I think that's an important aspect of this process, and we discussed it. I watched the meeting I watched the minutes of our meeting last time, and we thought it would go RFQ, RFP, so that we could see more distinction of what's to take place at that property. There you go. There's my concerns.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else has.
Yeah, I think that what we can do with the conversation about it is when the RFQs come back in, we can then look at, we can get recommendations from staff, as they'll be the ones filtering through some of these RFQs. We can get recommendations, and then this group, if this group feels one way or another, we can present a case. If we feel that we need to go RFP to get more in-depth proposals, then, if this committee chooses so to make that recommendation to the council, then we can make that. If this committee doesn't feel that way, then we can make that, and then the council can kind of take that and do
Is
its
that,
course of
is this whole process at the discretion of the council or the city manager?
I think, well, technically, the city manager is at the discretion of the council for a lot of, for this. So how,
Understandable.
I would say, my interpretation is that, the council has decided a policy of what is going to happen at that site. And so the city manager acts upon the discretion of a policy decision that the council has made. John?
Yeah, we're doing an RFQ process to pick a developer, and it is the city manager's job to carry out what the council wants to do, which is dispose of this property for the purposes of housing. But I agree with our co-chair. This committee can have a voice in whether we do an RFP and recommend that to the council. Anything that the city manager develops, I assume, will have to be approved and executed by the council because they're the governing body.
Okay.
I just want that concern noted. That's all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Has everyone been able to read over the minutes from the May 5th, 2024 meeting? Any adjustments? I would look for a motion to accept the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Perfect. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Unanimous. John, perfect. And okay, so we will go over to our guest speaker. A lot of people have talked about some questions that they have for the planning board. I know one of the things that we had talked about, and I think we'll end up integrating into our work plan, is the comparison of neighborhoods that we like and that we would like to be able to reproduce in other areas, and kind of what zoning will, whether our zoning would allow it or would not allow it. I know we talked about Atlantic Heights, Richards Avenue, Lincoln, some of those more dense, different densities, and what would be able to happen nowadays versus what we have done in the past. And so, introduction. This is Rick.
Hello. So John asked me to come this week. I haven't had a minute to do any preparation, but I'm ready to answer any questions. And I'm happy to come back to actually make a presentation. The topic of how to integrate more housing and densify neighborhoods is a hot topic nationally, actually internationally, and I'm pretty plugged into a lot of those conversations. So there are a number of people doing some very interesting work. I'm sure Tracy knows about this as well from her work. In other parts of the country, there's some really interesting things happening in Georgia and other, even out in Arizona, of all crazy places, to have housing where people shouldn't live because of the climate, but that's a separate topic. I think, as Joanna said, if the committee can focus on parts of the city or other areas that you think might be something that should be emulated, that's good feedback to then wrap regulations around, as opposed to having a conversation about, do we want build to line setback lines, FAR, word salad that would just take too long to try to explain and get people to understand. Technicalities that you don't need to understand, I don't think, unless you want to. We can have a whole zoning 101 to 805 if you want it. There's a series, it's sort of a nest of land use regulations in Portsmouth and pretty much any New Hampshire community, but cities are different than towns. There are more towns than there are cities in New Hampshire, so there are distinctions. And some of the recent press I've seen is a little bit wrong when it comes to looking at how things have been happening in Portsmouth, because the reporters have treated it like it was a town, and we're not. So in a town, and I was a selectman up in Tufton Borough for a long time, and I was on the planning board up there, so I'm very familiar with how it works on a town level. It's very different. You basically, without a special town meeting, you get one shot a year to make a change in zoning. And it's a very rigid process. With the planning board, by the time a planning board has a hearing in a town, you basically have to have all the commas and periods and semicolons in the right place, and it has to go to town meeting exactly like that. Here, in Portsmouth for the zoning component, because we have a hearing this evening, actually, on the solar amendments that you've probably been reading about. We will have a public hearing that, at that public hearing, and in fact, I will be bringing things to this public hearing that some people haven't even seen. Couldn't do that in a town, but it's completely okay in the city, because it starts the process. The planning board has to have a public hearing. The planning board, any zoning change can start with anybody. The planning board can start it of its own volition. This committee could ask for a zoning change. The council obviously can ask for a zoning change. Citizens can informally ask for a zoning change or formally submit a petition. But it has to start with a planning board hearing. Then it goes to the council right now for 3 readings. And there's still time for amendments until you get to the last council meeting. So it's a lot quicker than a town. It's a good process, actually, especially for a city as dynamic as Portsmouth, to be able to change the zoning as things are noticed, because we are seeing things. The Portsmouth zoning ordinance is rather complex. That is a criticism that I've heard, and I actually share it. I don't think you should have to hire a professional to be able to understand your zoning ordinance, but it is what it is, and we work with it. One of the things that will happen as a result of the master plan work that is coming out, I think we'll get some feedback from consultants working on that for recommendations perhaps to make modifications to zoning. That's not a part of the master plan process, but I think they'll have some ideas about how to perhaps simplify aspects of it. So zoning deals primarily with land uses, quantities and sizes of buildings, sizes of property lots that people can own in fee or lease, because subdivision is also, if you're leasing a piece of property, that's considered a subdivision as much as if you buy a house lot in a subdivision. Site plan review is another layer of regulations that applies to multifamily housing, which is 3 units or more, and commercial. Subdivision is sort of the simplest of all of them. It's basically if you're dividing land, whether for sale or lease, as I mentioned, but also condominium conveyance. That's also a subdivision. It's a topic I've had with some developers, but it really is a subdivision. So, and all of those flow through the planning board. The planning board can modify the site plan and subdivision regulations of its own volition. Zoning requires council review and approval. Full stop.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about kind of just what you were saying? So the planning board has the capacity to adjust site plan and subdivision regulations just as you guys kind of see fit. Is that a case-by-case scenario, or is that like a general feeling? Or?
It's not, you can't do it for an application.
Okay.
It's a regulation that pertains to all applications from that point forward. It would be wrong to, you could be informed by, if you have, I've always taken the position that if you find a regulation isn't working, you're constantly seeking a exception to it or a conditional use permit to get away from it. That usually indicates you should probably change it or get rid of it. Those are usually the options. So as we work with staff and look at applications as they come in, what's working, what's not working, and that's how you find out. Like the parking regulations are currently in zoning. I think, and other people think, they should probably be in site plan, where they could be more quickly modified and adjusted, because parking is very much a moving target, and zoning is much more rigid, as I meant. Even though we can change it fairly quickly with council approval, it still requires more of a process, and you can build more flexibility into a regulation if it's not in zoning, as opposed to being in site plan, for example.
And then, so you mentioned that the city, as you guys are looking at applications, are we trending that information to say like, oh, we're often seeing applications come up and they're asking for X, but we're being hit by this barrier? And is that how you're identifying where you can reasonably make, those changes?
In part, I have started talking to the chairs of the Board of Adjustment, and Conservation Commission, we're having joint meetings. We haven't had one with the ZBA yet, but I hope we will have one to get that feedback, because variances, for example, if there's a pattern to a series of variance requests, that definitely would point out there's a mismatch between the regulation and what people are trying to do.
Right, exactly. Okay, cool.
I hope that helps a little bit.
And feel free to ask questions. We have Rick for about 15-ish more minutes.
I have a few questions. So, let's see. You mentioned parking is sort of within zoning right now, and you posited that maybe it might be better within like the site plan regulations. What would the process be to like move that authority to the planning board?
It'd be a zoning amendment to remove it.
Okay.
So that would take a council vote.
Okay.
And it could be a tandem, because you wouldn't want a period where you didn't have parking regulations. You'd time it such that it would be coming into the site plan regulations as it left zoning if council was in agreement.
Okay. And then back all the way at the beginning, you mentioned sort of being plugged into things that are happening in other parts of the country, other efforts around housing and density. It'd be great, like, and maybe this is already, you're thinking of doing this, or you're going to bring this to us, but like the presentation on those examples, kind of what we're seeing other places, I think would be particularly helpful, and sort of what specific problems those changes are trying to solve, and I think it would be helpful for us, for me anyway. And then just a general question, what do you see as the biggest barriers to increasing the housing stock or the density across the entire city right now?
A whole host of things, including interest rates. I just got the RKG report as you did. I haven't finished reviewing it to see about the incentives in there, because they haven't been working, and I want to understand as an engineer and planner why they haven't been working. So I think those need to be adjusted, and that I think will help answer that question. But this is a really difficult question. It's not a Portsmouth question. It's not a New Hampshire question. Like I said, it's a national, international problem, and it's not an easy one to address. Some of the examples that I have been looking at all involve densification. So, the historical pattern of zoning, which started in the 1920s in around the New York City area and spread sort of up the Atlantic coast, goes back to a time when there were some pretty noxious uses being proposed in neighborhoods, and people were getting poisoned and hurt, and bad things were happening because you put the tannery next to the school. Bad idea. Wouldn't do that today, but they would do things like that. And so zoning started back then, and the actual original enabling federal legislation, the text in that is almost word for word with so many zoning ordinances today. It's filtered down through the years with few changes. And the other thing that's a part of that was the idea of a lot of single-family lots, and again, the separation of uses. So what we found, and what Portsmouth has for its character-based zoning, was first called form-based zoning, and is still called form-based zoning in other locations, because we found that in more recent years it's more about the scale of a building and what specifically is happening inside it, because so many commercial uses today aren't really dirty because of the other regulations that are imposed on commercial uses. So you don't have to worry about the tannery next to the school, because that's just not going to happen anymore. And the idea of having more flexibility and allowing buildings to evolve with their use is also part of the more current thinking with the zoning. That's partly in some of what we have, but I think what we have for our character-based zoning is it's trying to bridge that, the older zoning to the newer zoning, and it does a lot of it, but I think it could do more, be more refined in its approach.
Mary?
For character-based zoning, would that mean like making, matching the facades of buildings, or would that just be thinking a little bit less about what type of business is going in there or whether it's residential use.
It's more the latter than the former, but what character-based zoning, and back to the point I made earlier that Joanna mentioned, let's say you went to, let's say Market Street. Market Street is a beautiful street that is not permitted by most zoning ordinances in the state of New Hampshire. And by that I mean not the way out Market Street. That is. Sprawl Market Street you can do pretty much everywhere in America, but, coming back into town. Because of the proximity and the outdoor room effect of the buildings on either side of the street. So you can emulate that type, a character-based code, a form-based code can create that sort of a environment. And it doesn't all have to be at that density. It can be at much less density. But you can still create, and I think this is I know this is a benefit to affordable housing. If you make it a more walkable, bikeable neighborhood, it's more affordable by definition. If you don't need 4 cars for the family, it's going to save you a lot of money. So that's part of how you, in my world, and by the way, TND is traditional neighborhood design, and it started 30-plus years ago because I was working with some attorneys in Manchester and the developer in the Bedford area who wanted to do some, for that time, innovative work of recreating New England villages, and you can't do New England villages under most zoning regulations. So we actually wrote the first TND ordinance in Bedford, and it spread around the country. It's got different names, but the idea of allowing people to do things like they used to do before there were regulations, because everybody walked, and they sort of had a basic understanding of how to build a village and how to build a neighborhood. So you can't just be freewheeling like it was in 1750, but they did some pretty nice things back then.
Any more follow-up, Mary?
I was just thinking a little bit, because there's some conversation around like making sure something matches the look and feel of what's around it, and how we think about that as we're reconciling with like a densification effort. And so what are the boundaries for matching look and feel, and how far that would stretch from like a miles perspective, a footage perspective. So I'm just kind of thinking about that. I'm wondering if you could comment on that, because I think that's really relevant for some of the conversations we're having here.
I think there should be some design guidelines to go with pretty much everything that's happening in the city outside the historic district. The historic district, of course, the HDC has some authority, and it's not. I'm not suggesting that level of review, but there are ways, and it is allowed under New Hampshire statutes and case law it's a planning board issue to have design guidelines that could address exactly what you're saying and to provide some aesthetic input and some compatibility. It's not going to get down to compatible colors and that sort of a thing necessarily, but scale and materials, it can address things like that.
Okay, so it could also look into like having a mix of mixed use, higher builds, and as well like single family homes. So it wouldn't just be, or there would be some conversation around how that could develop as well from a density perspective. I'm just thinking about different neighborhoods around the city that are perhaps a little bit more oriented to single family homes, and then bringing in like a Market Street idea as we move further.
Well, without, we could start sketching and get this better understood, but I think what you're talking about is a transition from a denser to a less dense neighborhood, which is also a pretty classic pattern, and that's something you can wrap regulations around as well, because you wouldn't necessarily, there are parts of the city that can probably use some densification. That doesn't mean the entire area should turn into 20 units to the acre. So you can specify percentages, and those details, the technical details, would come from the images that you say, this looks good, that looks like too much, that's too much like New York City, whatever, then it's easy to back from those images into what it means technically.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Dee? And then Eric.
No, I'm glad you asked. Assuming that you want to stimulate a affordable housing market, which it sounds like you do, and trying to be pragmatic, what do you think are the most obvious and achievable changes that we could recommend as a policy body?
I don't know yet.
Okay.
Once I finish reviewing the RKG, I will share freely. I don't want to mislead anybody, so that's a big question, obviously.
Yeah, and the interest rate is something we can't control. So I'm curious about the things that we can. I would love to invite you back once you have finished that review to present that material, because I think it'd be really valuable for us.
Well, that's up to you guys.
I think that would be a great recommendation for when we start working on what we'd like to see in the work plan. More work sessions with the plan.
I mean, I don't know who else has images we could share with, different neighborhoods in the city and other areas that you guys could look at and go, that's great. And I'd encourage you to walk the neighborhood as much as you can. So you don't have to carry measuring devices with you and that sort of a thing. You don't need to know that the building's 43.2 feet high or anything like that. If it feels good, that's good. And if it doesn't feel good, that's good too. You should note it. And we can learn from it.
Well, I think that's kind of the irony sometimes, is that these historical qualities that we value in Portsmouth, some of them we cannot replicate today.
Right.
And that's telling to me.
The entire South End is pretty much
Non-conforming,
illegal everywhere in the United States.
including in our own zoning currently.
Yeah, in our own zoning. And there are neighborhoods that the fire regulations alone would not allow it, not even close. So that's unfortunate.
Eric? Our second bite.
Thank you. In prior meetings, we've had particular focus on one particular piece of property at the Sherburne School site. And the way we understood it is it was going from recommendations here is it went to the City Council for disposition. And I'm not sure where it went from City Council and their perspective on disposition, but it was indicated that after that it would go to the planning board, and it was just curious of what was is that the way it was going to go, or what was the planning board going to do with any disposition issue that the council was trying to seek? Did they have anything concrete that they could look at and review? Because right now, like I said, we've only had focus on one particular piece of property. And do you have any indication of whether you're going to make any disposition on that one site?
Well, do folks understand how the planning board process works?
Say again?
Do you understand how the planning board process works? I mean, obviously Tracy does, but.
Maybe not as completely as I should, but
Okay, let's assume a proponent, let's say you go through your RFQ process, you pick somebody, then you go to an RFP, they start producing sketches to something that they want to do on that property. Let's say you're the client. First they'll review them with you, get something that you like, maybe a couple of different ideas that you like. Well, we like this, but can we do it? There might be a problem with the zoning. You go to the planning board for what's called a pre-application discussion, where it's non-binding. You can come in with your team and have a conversation with the planning board to get some feedback on, we do like this, but we found a problem on this corner. Could we get some relief because we want to do whatever it is you want to do that is difficult in that corner? You get feedback from the planning board. And as a pre-application discussion and non-binding, you get more of a free exchange of ideas. So the planning board you might find out you need a variance. You might find out if you change something, you could get a conditional use permit, which means you stay at the planning board and the planning board can review it. You take that information, you go back to your design team, decide what you want to present more formally, and you start the formal review process. That is, as I said, more formal. It leads to public hearings where the abutters and other interested parties can come and speak for and against, or just speak to an application. And ultimately, if you get through the process, the planning board approves it with or without conditions. In fact, the planning board has to either approve it, deny it, or approve it with conditions. We don't have a choice. We can't say, can't make up our mind. Can't do that under state law.
And so I do understand that component of the planning board, but the way the discussion has gone in this group, to the best of my recollection, is that after the disposition, there was going to be something brought to the planning board, and the planning board had nothing to review. They had no site plans, they had no designs for you to make comment on. So at least that's the way I understood it from Peter Britz at one particular point of the conversation of how things were going to flow. It was somehow the planning board was going to be consulted with no plans, and apparently we're not. And it just brings back my original concern of the process as it's proceeding. If you go to an RFQ, you find the qualified candidates to put together an RFP, and then that RFP would produce some type of design that you would be able to review. But I'm kind of confused. Is it, just because you said it's at the option of the council of whether they're going to have an RFP, but I read the RFQ and I saw nothing in there that asked for any type of design. It was just basically a qualification aspect of who's going to submit some type of design and proposal. So that's the question I'm starting to raise with regard to process. I understand your role in this at some particular, juncture when you have something that you can look at on paper and say, all right, we don't like this, we don't like that, or we do like it, or anything like that. But as I understand it, I don't see that in development right at the moment, or optionally in development. If all of a sudden you stop the process with an RFQ and then there it just kind of disappears of what is the planning board going to review if it's just a qualification issue?
Okay, staff.
I can speak to that. I don't know. I don't know what I had said that said the planning board would review it before there was something to review, because that's what they do. They review plans. So.
I paid close attention to your answer when we discussed that, and you made some indication.
I had said they were going to the planning board. Initially, it may have been what Rick described, the initial consultation with the planning board, but they would still have a plan to review. And then they'd come back with a more complete set of plans, and the planning board would do a more thorough review. So it could have been that. Maybe that is what the...
And I think there was definitely some conversation that I said that I would hope that if any developer would like to partner with the city, that they would be open to coming in and having just community-based discussions with the planning board, what could be done, what couldn't be done. But at this point, as you are correct, there's nothing for us to submit to the planning board. So the planning board is not involved in, again, and I like to make this very clear, and I would be remiss to not say that there has been some frustration shared that it feels like we are constantly going back to Sherburne in the conversations that I don't want to say are not relevant to Sherburne, but that we will be building Sherburne and those conversations into our work plan. And I think what I want to make sure that doesn't happen is that we aren't kind of spinning circles when I think some of these questions, when we develop our workflow plan, will filter in naturally. John.
Yes, I was also going to say something of the same nature. We understand Eric and Megan and others would like a little more clarity on the process. And I think that's a conversation we can have. And I think we probably should try and look out in the future and give you a little more clarity about that. But I'm also sensitive to the use of our time here that, we're looking at ways that we can keep the character of the city but add some density, as Rich says. And that's a big conversation, and there are many pieces to that work. So right now we're in the RFP process. I think that's a good time to pause our discussion of Sherburne. And we should get back to you with a little more clarity about the process. But we've also got all this other work to do. And we have Rick tonight, and I think let's take advantage of that.
Fine. I'm interested in hearing what he said. I just wanted to match it up against what has taken place in previous meetings and his involvement at this particular juncture. And I understand what your role is at a particular time when there's something that you can make comment on, but right now there's nothing.
And I would say I totally understand. This has been a work in progress. This group is a work in progress. This trying to figure out what we're focusing on. Obviously, it took us 3 meetings to figure out a goal statement. So please, for at least with me, ask for a little bit of grace to, as we figure out what we want to do. We weren't sure we wanted to go to RFQ versus RFP. We weren't sure if we, wanted. If it was going to be a council policy decision that it was just going to go to a certain developer or X, Y, and Z. So, with input from this group, the RFQ option rose to the top. And so that is what then the group, the committee recommended to the council. And so at this point, there is not much else for the committee to do in the purview of Sherburne until the RFQs start coming back in.
But it still is established, and I think you've established your priorities in the discussion. The first thing this group did was to approve a letter of PHA for $3 million to seed their project. So we made some designation, and it was specifically directed at Sherburne. So Sherburne has been the property of discussion at now. I understand the work plan is maybe going to start with a blank page, but this process did not start with a blank page. Sherburne was put in, Sherburne was up front and foremost as the premier piece of property that was going to be developed.
As a policy decision of the city council, absolutely, and the council still stands by that. What I'm saying is I do not see what the work for this committee to be done within this session, right, within today, but because the RFQ is out. I completely understand Sherburne is still at the top priority of this committee, but my understanding is that there's not work for this committee to do at this singular moment until we get more back from the RFQ.
I understand that, and I just want that clarity in the process, at least expressed. It's.
I would say this is a moving process. This is the first time I've ever gone through this process. So there are things that I may at one point in time feel, and then I'm educated from staff, from planning board, from other members that say, hey, that actually, here's a different way that we can go through this process. Here's a different way that we could do this. Hey, it's zoned a certain way that we can go X, Y, and Z way. We can look at changing zoning to go X, Y, and Z. So, I think that while I would love to have a ... roadmap of point A, point 1A, B, 1B, 1.2C, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to deliver that if that's what you're looking for.
Right. I never recognized, and I try and pay attention to the council process, that the council actually made the designation that Sherburne was the place to go right from the get-go. We didn't start with a blank page. We started with Sherburne, and that's what I hoped this process or this committee was going to unfold, is that we started with a blank page. Sherburne was no different than any other site of potential development.
I would disagree with you in the fact that the land use committee came back with their recommendations, and now as it stands now, the city council has made a policy decision that Sherburne will be below market rate housing.
Okay. All right. I never.
Howard.
There was a land use.
So,
Go ahead.
I just want to reiterate the importance of Rick is here.
Yes.
And I would like to offer out what a possible flow is of actions of this committee, and correct me if I'm wrong or reiterate if I'm right. So we spoke collectively now about making recommendations on zoning, not specific to setback changes, the technicalities, the dimensional aspects. But if this committee were to say, we believe if we were able to maintain the character of the South End, but increase the density that is there without modifying appearances, and make that as a recommendation, it would flow up to City Council. And with the recommendation may go the motion of through zoning and regulatory changes. So city council would then say, we agree or don't agree with this, and they would move it to the planning board for you to undertake and develop specific zoning reform or changes and so forth. Am I correct so far?
It could go from here to the planning board to council, but logically, I think the way you said, get council feedback and then go to the planning board is probably politically smart.
And as a blue ribbon committee, we're a recommendation
Advisory.
advisory.
Right.
But to refine what
Volunteer
you said a little
citizens.
bit too, as opposed to focusing on the south end, which is beautiful, it's also pretty dense, and it would be hard to densify it.
Just as an
So,
example.
right. I think, depending on the availability of staff resources, if we could look at other neighborhoods, I'd be happy to work with them to try to see what might happen in other locations, because I know there's land in other locations, and you need to see what it might mean to densify some of these other neighborhoods.
So as a follow-up quickly to that, so then process would play out where planning board would develop zoning changes. In the hope would be then that possibly you could come back and educate the housing committee saying this is what's been developed out of your recommendation, or would you then say, okay, city council, this is what should be done for zoning change?
Yes, it could do that, but it would also, in coming back to the discussion with this group, we could say, this is what could be done if the zoning changed, because probably what we would be looking at wouldn't be allowed under current zoning. Many neighborhoods you can't densify,
Right.
but physically you could. And the question is, can it be done in a way that people find aesthetically pleasing and just generally pleasing or not? And I don't think that's going to be universal around the city. I think we'll find it'll vary by areas of the city.
Jen?
Sort of piggybacking on what Howard said, recently 39 lots were added to gateway zoning. And I'm curious how that process originated and what steps were taken, because I think that's one of the things we're interested in expanding on.
Well, let's start with the land use committee.
I'll answer that. 2 years ago,
I know.
we started.
You got to dig into it. So we started with a conversation around, so gateway zoning started in 2017, to do a little backtracking, and we were putting it along our gateways. So we had a conversation about what has happened in gateway, and then what could we go another lot depth? Like it was one lot along the gateways. Could we go 2 lots deep? And would that make sense on adjacent properties to expand the gateway in order to give more opportunities to be able to do this mixed residential property, so that we have less, the whole idea around Gateway was less strip malls and more neighborhoods, right?
Yeah.
More little like Portsmouth Green, right? Starting to mix the residential and the commercial all on the same site. So that was where the conversation started. We looked at, how many properties did we look at?
Like 60 in total.
Yeah, so like 60 or 70 properties. We went down Lafayette. We were on the outer Woodbury, and all those, the off the traffic circle, the bypass. We looked at a lot of different places, and we kind of dwindled it down to a list where, like, okay, in this bucket, these all seem like everyone agrees this is a really good thing to go forward. And then we pulled out the other, I call it the yellow and the green list. And the yellow list is kind of still sitting there. I have it.
So you started with 60, got down to 39. It sort of made sense.
It went back and forth. After we broke it down, then we realized we might have missed a lot or two. So it changed over time. There were other changes, like looking at Oriental Gardens. It made no sense that Oriental Gardens, a mobile home park, was in office research.
Yeah.
So in the process of doing that, we're like, well, while we're doing this, let's clean that up and make it garden apartment mobile home. So, we did some little things like that as well.
And then you made that, land use committee made that recommendation to city council.
And we asked City Council to send it to Planning Board. Planning Board then looked at it and made a recommendation back to City Council, which finally, it's all moved
And
forward.
I think it's worth noting that it was about a year and a half.
Everything I've done's taken 1.5 years to 2 years.
Yeah. So these changes were not overnight. It took months of planning board, months of staff.
Same with the ADUs. It took a year and a half to 2 years.
And then went to planning board, spent a lot of time in planning board where they worked through it, because they also, on top of the recommendations that whether this group or another group brings to them, they have their site reviews. They have their technical job.
We have applications that actually come on top of zoning changes, so it's juggling all of that.
That said, it doesn't always take that long, as you will see with the solar amendments
Well, we were kind of forced. That was
going
kind of
on warp speed. So
that has
Okay, Byron, and then we'll give one more quick bite of the apple, and then we only have half an hour left. So we'll go through work plan. Luckily, it doesn't seem like a huge public comment crowd.
So the south end was mentioned in terms of the existing properties are non-conforming. Maybe this is a question for staff, but I think it'd be really interesting just as a data point to know how many lots in the city are in fact non-conforming. Like, what's the percentage?
That's a lot. Just go a lot.
Right off the top of our head.
It was actually a goal of, in the current master plan that was something that the planning staff was working on, but
Yeah.
I've actually started looking into that.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting because to the point around patterns in the request for variances and sort of like behavior is the best design. If our behaviors aren't anywhere near our design, I think it's a really good indication. And then so I'm really interested in the idea of, you mentioned sort of going from dense to less dense. There's a city center, and then maybe there's neighborhoods, and there's this transition area. And then couple that with what Beth's multiple-year-long process around adding lots to Gateway. Sort of what's in my mind is how is there opportunity, or is there examples out in the world that you're aware of a zoning system that allows for these things to not be the friction in the process around changing those lots over time, right? So it's like if we gateway these particular lots around the corridors, and then like we come back again in some amount of time, and like we expand that outwards. That's sort of a manual process and is arduous, and maybe that's how it has to be. But I'm interested in exploring the idea of ways to build that into the zoning code itself, so it can be dynamic, instead of having to necessarily come back and sort of comb over it every time as we make the changes.
cities have a lot more flexibility, as I mentioned earlier, and you can, and I've suggested this to a couple of counselors, it's actually possible to have more of it happen at the planning board level and have the council come down to one meeting. That it could be redone that way. And the benefit for that, in my mind, of course I'm on the planning board, is that the technical issues get resolved with the technical board. The council is more policy and politics, and I think you can get dragged into the weeds at that level. I've seen it happen. And if the council's final action is either to, more like a town meeting vote in a town, either to accept it or reject it, then I think that could streamline the process and allow it to adapt more quickly. But it's not burdensome the way it is. I don't want to give you that, because like I said, with the solar, and we'll see what happens tonight and what happens at the next council meeting, but it can move quickly. It just takes
About the next, June 3rd.
big effort.
Are we, I hate to cut anyone off, but we do only have 20 more minutes, and we really need to work on the work plan. If anyone has any more specific questions for Rick, please email them to me. I will email them to him, and then I'll disperse it to the whole group, and we will set up a time once we really solidify our work plan to do more conversations with the planning board, so we can get everyone feeling comfortable on a basic understanding. But also remember, we don't just have Rick, we do have staff, and so and they too sit on the planning board also, so we do have a constant resource. And
One of
Beth,
them.
yes, Beth, and Beth.
Not all of them.
Okay, so I'm going to pass it. Thank you so much, Rick. Love you, Rick.
Thank you.
And I'm going to pass it over to Howard quickly to do the Housing Navigator update, and then everyone has seen our work plan. Perfect.
No, they haven't.
Nobody's not. Don't worry. You will all see.
Like I'm far behind.
I was like, don't worry about me.
Can you expand on that?
Eric, I just shared with the group that if Rick is obviously leaving, if you have any specific questions you would like for him, please email it to us, and we will get it over to him and the answers sent out to everyone.
So I have a quick presentation on work plan, because we've been starting to toss it around. It's starting to introduce and show itself almost every meeting now. So How's it advance? He gave me this, it doesn't advance.
Sorry.
What is up on the screen is what I think everybody is familiar with in terms of a work plan, right? You've got your action items, you've got timeline, you've got go, no go, or we're going to think about it a little bit. And everybody here has exposure to a work plan, but I would speculate that it's a little bit more specific to your background. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to go through. Make it what?
Can you make it larger?
Oh, that wasn't a real, that was just
That was
literally
just
a
a
picture.
generic-
That was just a picture.
Yeah, it's like,
There's
I need
nothing
lace
in-
sticking out too.
there's
That
no-
is not our
nothing
work
in a work
plan. Right? So it was just an introduction. Everybody's got an idea of what a work plan is. I think there's some helpful, but I wanted to bring a little bit more. Everybody has a similar mind's eye. So what I did was there's 4 primary components to a work plan. Define your goals, objectives, and the action steps. And if you recall from my conversation with you a little bit earlier on the idea of what a goal is and what an action item is. So next. So after you develop those goals and objectives and action items, you develop assignments of those tasks. And an example would be, we have a goal to reform or make reforms to zoning. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, we could create a little task or a subcommittee to this, to do that type of work. Next. Third is you start preparing your timeline. Is this an immediate phase? Is this 0 to 1 years? Is this 0 to 1 month? Is it going to be 6 months? Or is it a longer term? Do we start it now and do we keep working on it for phase 2, which might be 2 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years as the phase 3? So move to number 4. And as you go through those first 3 components, there's evaluation to what the constraints and the limitations are, and that will inform some of your activity that goes on in terms of your timeline and who undertakes the task. So those are what I'm suggesting. Here is an example of what the Land Use Committee had for a work plan when it came down to making changes and amendments for building heights. It dealt with what code section was involved, the housing type impacted, the master plan goal, policy assignments. There's a lot of complexity to this. I hope to simplify for this committee your work plan. So it is still going to consider the zoning code, the master plan, and it's also going to consider the goals and the actions that were achieved during the public engagement process. So go to the next. So coming back to defining goals and objectives, your homework, because I don't think we're going to be able to get to it today, your homework, my request to you, is before the next meeting, in a timely manner, you're going to email me your objectives, the actions you believe need to be taken, your goals, the objectives of those goals, and what the actions, and you can even start throwing in the idea of timelines and things like that. I will take all those, organize them, and have them at the next meeting, and that's when the great debate's going to start, where you're going to agree or disagree about prioritizing what's going to be more important, what's not.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Work plan ideas, email them what we're doing.
Right, but goals, you want goals?
You want your goals, and then a component underneath or part of that goal is the objectives. Why is this goal important to you? That's the objective. And then your action steps. So Eric, to borrow from one I think you've spoken about before, is when are we going to look at other sites around the city? So that's your goal. Have the committee go out and explore the idea of housing on other properties that the city's own, right? So that's your goal. Your objective is to find other city-owned properties that would be suitable for housing. And in actions, what are the actions? Well, have the committee go out and look at the site, right? Have city staff evaluate if this property and that property is going to be viable. And so how long do you think it's going to take? What's your timeline for that? Let's look at it now and start developing ideas in the future, or is it something you want to take over time? So that's just an example. So feed that information to me, get it to me within a week or so, and then I can send it back out to the committee. So you have another week to say, I agree with this, I don't, this is duplicate. And then at the meeting, we can have it a little bit better organized.
Can I?
Megan? Oh.
I just want to offer a, I don't know, little tidbit. Could we potentially have like the Excel spreadsheet just like blank emailed to us, because then we can populate what our goals are, and then when you get them all back, it'll be way easier for you to put them all together in one spreadsheet.
It sounds like it'd be easier for you to
Okay.
put things down, but I will send out a form, but it's not going to be the complete work plan. I just want to maintain this higher level of information at first, and so we can start sorting it, and then we can get in, and I can send it back out after that.
Okay.
So-
And then will we be able to know sort of who nominated each goal?
Yeah,
Committee.
is everyone okay with that? Nobody feels the need
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
anonymous? Yeah.
Own it,
And
people,
I
just
think
own
we're,
it.
and I think what he, we'll get into, we say great debate, but conversation. And so at some point, if you feel like your goal needs to be in phase one, you should be advocating for your objective to be in phase one versus, if I'm like,
Everyone
hey,
should
I
write
want
them
to
in
look
priorities.
at, attacking Ps. Okay, well, I know that that's going to be phase 3 because we've been trying to attack housing on Ps since they took away all the housing on Ps. So I know, you know what I mean? For me personally, while it is very important, I know that there are other things and would listen, if you're advocating well enough, you've sold me, okay, I'll bump mine down. So I think it will be a great, Eric? And that was just for Jux, for the record.
Upon your recommendation, I think, isn't it already been established with land use that there is identified properties that would be suitable for this, or are we assigned the task to go out and, search for properties that might not be applicable for this?
Well, I'll bounce it back, Eric. I think that's up for you to decide when you send me your goal. If you want to say, let's pick up where this was done in terms of the staff did evaluation of city-owned property. Or you could say that would be where we're going to start, and your objective would be to make that list bigger. So an action would be ask staff to add to this list.
Could we see that? Could at least you eliminate that
It was
process?
emailed out in one of the early packets.
It's in the earlier packet, but
Yeah.
I'll send it to you separately.
Okay.
I have a lot of links collected. I can send them to you of all of the times that the land use reviewed that. There's a link to that video, I think, too. I can send you that too, if that's helpful.
I just don't want to duplicate work that's already been done. With other ideas that might, be infiltrated in this process.
And to return to Megan, recognizing this group's enthusiasm and smarts, with the debate that occurred over a goal statement, it is a cautionary request of, I'll send out that spreadsheet, but don't start populating until it starts becoming AA, AB, and AC farther along.
Yeah, let's
with
just
all
work
these
on
ideas.
the
First 3
4
columns.
dots or whatever.
Please,
like,
mercifully, let's do that.
we do that. Like
Okay.
I get told,
You'll have
hey,
a chance
Megan, only
later
A
on.
through N this time.
No, you don't, Meg.
Yeah, it's fine.
So, ending the presentation, this is something that John sent to me. When you start thinking of the work plan, start with the big, you think it can be achievable first, and then we can start thinking about the smaller pieces. And as he phrased it, the goal, 500 units, what are going to be some of the objectives and action items to fill that? So.
And I think I think we'll end up finding out when we all send them to Howard. There are going to be some that are very, if not identical, very similar, and then we'll something as innocuous as we want to figure out parking regulations as it is with housing. So, somebody may write, I want to eliminate parking. How do we do this? How do we, how do we look at it? And so I think, Howard will be the one who goes through and says, okay, these are close enough that we can kind of.
I'll start just providing some structure and give it to the committee again to be able to flesh out. And the idea going with a goal is a reform to parking standards. Well, the objective is to provide better opportunity for housing. What actions? And then you can line out the actions to it.
Howard, would you just provide an example when you send it out to us? And it can even be an elementary
Yeah,
one.
I'll put it up at the front. And
Yeah, just so that
this is what we're going to do first, but it will be.
so that we have a template for okay, tracking, this is where we should start, objective.
What the content would be in this column.
Yes, precisely.
And even use the recent gateway zoning changes as the example.
Well, I was just going to say,
there we go.
maybe we could, I think it would be good too for the group to see an example of
We had a work plan at land use that we started with. It had 3 phases in it.
Yes.
I don't know if it would be at all helpful.
That was the first.
Howard showed us.
Yeah, but it completed. You could see what we actually started with to how we got to everything. I don't know if that would be helpful.
but also the
Very much so.
the timeline too of we started the ADU stuff and then it was a year and a half later we got the handbook done. So I think that the conversation too is that as Rick said, some changes are very easy to get done in a shorter amount of time, and then some changes are we're going to be working through these things for 6-8 months.
So the work plan is going to address some of the work the land use committee
Didn't get to.
did. Right. Putting it.
We had lofty goals.
Yeah.
As you should.
Yes. While we're on the subject of the gateway and designing and whatnot, on June 20th at 4 p.m., there's going to be a site walk and kickoff for a charrette process for the Lang Road property behind Service Credit Union. And all day on Friday, June 20th, is going to be an all-day charrette process. They're still working up things for me to send out with more particulars, but in case anyone's interested in partaking in that, those are the dates.
And
You
then,
said Friday, June 20th? I think it would be Friday,
the
June
21st. Yes. I brought up my calendar so I wouldn't get it wrong, and I still said it wrong. The kickoff is on the 20th, that Thursday at 4 o'clock, and then the all day is the 21st.
Cool.
and then we received an invitation. This committee received an invitation from Tom Morgan. There is an invitation to tour the cottages at Back River Road in Dover on Monday, May 20th at 5 p.m. If anyone would like to go, just please contact me and I will get you that information. And then we are going to list it on the city website for a potential quorum, just in case.
We have a work session.
Yeah, we won't be going.
Oh, yeah.
But
So that invitation was in a previous packet.
I just wanted to-
And we've already noticed.
great.
So you're covered.
Great.
I've already seen them.
Can the dates that just get rattled off, the one for Lang Road and the one for that, can we have that
Email to you?
email?
I'll get them to Jo and she can email them.
Thank you.
We can get them out. Yes.
While we're on the topic of calendars, at some point, this committee was going to stop meeting every other
Yes.
week. How long do we?
I would assume after we establish this work plan and figure out within this work plan of any working groups, and then ideally we will break off a little bit into working groups and then come down. I would assume over the summer at least that we would be just looking at one meeting a month, because I know people have children and schedules change in the summer. So I would assume at least for June and July, July and August, we'll be at one meeting. And then once we kind of spend the next few weeks, I assume that this work plan is going to take us a few weeks to really thoroughly get through. Please correct me if you think I'm wrong. Maybe we're all put our smart hats on one day and get it done in a day, but I think that we have so many goals. And then I would assume that we would kind of look at potentially working groups and then going down to once a month meetings. Eric?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that July and August, or, that we would be going to once a month, but at least until we've concluded the process of Sherburne, I would like to think that this committee can be active as much as possible in that process to understand what's going to be developed out there. And because that's on a short fuse. That's on a short fuse in August where the drop dead date for submitting, plans to the federal government for housing credits is going to take place. I think that's the way I understand it.
I had heard from somebody, and I could be wrong, and I will look. I think it's. Didn't the
It
date
got moved
moved
slightly into September.
It got moved slightly into September. I'm just saying that. I'm saying potentially. I'm not saying it is for July and August because I know people have families, people have children, people go on summer vacation, and there's potential that we won't be able to have a quorum. So I think we should, if we are deemed to need those meetings, the group, we can figure that out as we go through the work plan. But there is a potential that we won't have enough people to have a quorum.
If that be the case, that be the case. But, as this process develops in the RFQ, RFP time frame that's going to take place up to that drop dead date that these organizations have to submit some type of intentions for federal, housing credits, it's going to be important, for at least from my perspective, to start to get some visualization of what's going to take place at Sherburne and see what we can do to engage anybody that's interested in that discussion of what's going to happen at Sherburne. It's going to be happening. It's going to be happening. So I would like to see us stay as active as possible, even with the constraints of summer and the intentions of summer. But for us to just kind of, tone down our meeting schedule and let this stuff take place without our knowledge, I think would be inappropriate. Well, it would be disappointing.
That's why I said potential.
John has his hand up.
John, and then Howard.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was going to say, we as a committee, or the city, city manager, we don't design projects. Developers design projects. So I think it's a fallacy to think that, or it would be a mistake to think that we can get clarity on what's going to go at Sherburne from without a developer. All that starts to happen after a developer is selected and there's a memorandum of understanding with that developer, and then the developer starts to develop the treatments. So I just want to make that point that, the city is not going to come up with the schemes and
I know
things to look at.
that's real.
We need a developer for that.
Yeah, I completely understand that. And that process is going to be taking place through a city process of RFQs, RFPs, so on and so forth. So the developer is an intricate component of that discussion and what they plan, what they project, and what they are capable of doing at that one particular site.
I just think it's important to note that we have a willing developer in PHA, and we've decided to slow the process down in order to have
the
a
RFQ, RFP process. They were, I don't say eliminated, they were neutralized. Because now it's
There are some people who think that's an unfortunate turn of events, myself being one of them.
Okay, but
And I think I would like to point out,
let's recognize that they were
Eric-
neutralized with
Eric,
that process. All right.
Mr. Dagan's not interrupting you, so let's him.
I would like to point out the city council ran on an agenda of affordability in the city and housing being one of their main points, and they were elected from 1 to 9, re-elected. So I think it's important to understand that while we are here as a committee trying to be thorough about how we move through this process, the Sherburne being one of those things, the will of the community is that we should be moving on this project. So when we talk about the short fuse, it's a short fuse that we've essentially created for ourselves. Where if we had gone through with if we had chosen PHA as they were willing to partake in this process and to be the developer of the Sherburne property, we might be already at the point where we could be talking about what those plans look like.
Undoubtedly. But we didn't choose that way.
No, we didn't, and that's okay. But I do think it's important to note that we have a willing developer.
Who could emerge as the developer.
Okay. Perfect. And as we go through this, we'll make sure that we get updates from staff on what the process that the council decides to go. If they decide to stay just with RFQ and then pick a developer from there, if they decide to go to RFP, I think it's very important to note that all of those options are open. There's not just one path forward. I want to make sure it's very clear that there is a chance that this doesn't go to RFP, that it goes from RFQ to a chosen partner to ideally some conversational community working groups to a plan to permitted to done. So I just want to make sure that it's clear for this committee and the public that there is a variation of steps that could happen in this process, especially because it's municipally owned property. So I just want to make that very, very clear that.
Public comment?
Public comment, perfect. Anyone from the public like to comment? Come on up, just state your name, make sure you pull the mic up. That is one thing I want to remind the committee, we have to talk into the mics.
Thank you. Jim Smalley, I have a question.
Yes.
In the very first meeting, I thought you mentioned at some point the public would be able to interact.
Yes, that has been my serious goal every time. I just feel like every meeting we talk about adding more of a public dialogue. I will figure out, Jim, I'm committed to it, figure out when and how to get that in.
Yeah, and I know this might be a sore spot for some folks, but you talk about measuring success by the number of approved units, or 500 units is the target. That actually doesn't measure affordability, right? It measures a public response to, it targets a certain income level based upon median income. Nothing to do with affordability, actually, right? So just as another metric, I would suggest something like median house price divided by median income. It gives you a multiple, right? San Francisco had a multiple of, I think it was 7 or 9 or something like that. An affordable city has a multiple of roughly 3 or less in that area, right? And the same thing could be done with rents, right? What's the median income divided by the rents? And that could be tracked.
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, that will help measure affordability. The hardest part about getting this done, despite, and the gentleman was great here, I'd love to talk to him a bit, it's political. It's not interest rates, it's none of that stuff. Yes, it's happening all over the country. 1985 or so, there were only, I want to say it was 10,000 municipalities in the country that had heavy zoning. Now there's almost 17,000. That zoning since 1970 has focused on protecting the incumbent rights, and that's such as single-family zoning. There's nothing wrong with single-family zoning, nothing. But what does have an impact is how much land does it take to build a unit? And what's happened is it's taken more land to build the same unit. So that actually would help as you look at density, and it can be, we can call it gentle density or whatever. As you increase density, it doesn't have to be a 21-story high-rise, right? The house, I listed off, I think, 7 or 8 different factors that go into artificially increasing the cost the last time I spoke. All of those that I mentioned artificially increase the cost. Whether it be floor area ratios, I know Rick said we don't want to get into those details. The devil's in the details, so please pay attention to them. It's simple economics. You've talked about incentives and mandates. Incentives are the worst thing you can do. Let me pull that back. When you do density bonuses, right, it says you can have this number of units. However, if you add this number of affordable units, it'll be granted, right, in effect. So you've increased the density there. In the first case, it's only going to happen if it's economically feasible, if it's market feasible. In the second case, the density, it's only going to happen if it's economically feasible, market feasible. In both cases, the decision's market-based. It has nothing to do with the incentives, which is counterintuitive. And if you think about, and I know it's almost like this poker game or negotiation that cities like to have with developers, there is no free lunch here. Affordability is increased with things such as character-based zoning, the aesthetics. You're not here to paint a picture. I mean, maybe what you want to, but you can change things. It's not as though if you we'll use, what is it, dumpster housing or whatever it is that people took tractor, the old
Shipping containers.
shipping containers. They'd begin dropping those in areas. I wouldn't mind seeing one or two of them because it would add character. Actually, it would add a distinct flavor.
Character is subjective.
Right, exactly. So is taste. This housing crisis, it's only called a housing crisis because it's no longer affecting the poor. It's a housing crisis because it's affecting folks of middle income, 50, 60,000. When I talked about those metrics of median price divided by income, you should also have absolutes. Median price divided by 50,000, median price divided by 100,000. That way you can step it and track it based upon those levels. And now I forgot where I was going. The idea is this crisis was caused by incumbents those who already live here, the incumbents being able to say, no, we don't like this. This isn't a local problem, it's hyper-local. It's neighborhood driven. And to some degree, as I mentioned last week, unless you're willing to tear out all that stuff, all those artificial pieces that increase the cost, we're all to some degree a NIMBY, right? And maybe some of that's okay. But you got to be honest with yourself and say, you know what? The cost to live in Portsmouth, you have to have an income of $75,000. What's the entrance fee to get into Portsmouth? Right? That can actually be quantified. And if you look at the zoning requirements, what has been banned, it hasn't been banned because it's unattractive. Everyone here thinks Portsmouth, there are parts of Portsmouth that are unbelievable, the diamonds, right? The gems. They're illegal from political choice. Nothing more. And yes, this is happening all over the country. But there have been reforms, whether it be Austin or actually San Francisco's done some, Maine has done some. They're trying to pull away, but it is a political battle. If you think getting parking changed is hard, try changing single-family zoning. It's an absolute uphill battle. I'm probably at 3 minutes, but I could go on and on and on this stuff. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll make sure we build in to the work plan some of those public dialogue sessions.
The last piece is there's no economist on the planning board that I can tell. Right?
Thank you. Anything else? Okay. So send over Howard your stuff, ideally within 5-ish business days, so that he can go through it and get it out to us.
Send them to you and
Send them to me. Don't ever send anything directly to him. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? Heard it. Great. All in favor? Unanimous. Thank you so much.